Okay, we're starting off with our appendix for episode 2 of Apothecary Diaries. Now we're jumping right in, and I talked about all the setup and all the plans I have for the show in episode 1. You can watch it over here. It is quite a lot longer than this video, but I've chaptered it so you can just pick and choose if you actually want to watch it. So without any delays, let's jump right in. And this is the first thing we're going to talk about. And this building, basically, it really highlights the nature of this show very well. That it is a combination of various different time periods in Chinese history. Because the Rare Palace is based on Forbidden City in Beijing, the whole design of it and the whole style. However, the specific style of this building is something older than Forbidden City. Because Forbidden City, as China's capital, started off in about year 1300, so it's about 700 years of history. Whereas these kind of building style in particular were of an earlier period, from 6th century all the way to 10th century. In particular, what's basically interesting about this is they have red pillars and white walls, which is very typical of Tang Dynasty Chinese building color scheme. Whereas if you take a look at the picture over here, that's more typical of a building you'll find in Forbidden City. Usually they're either pure red walls with red pillars, or they might have a brick-colored or stone-colored base. There is no plastered white wall that goes along with red pillars. And then if you take a look over here, all the other walls are red walls and with a green trim and also a stone-colored base. And this is quite typical. You find this everywhere, noticeably different from the other building we saw. And then we move on to Lady Gyoukuyo's palace. I gotta say, the animators did do a lot of research. This is not a carbon copy of one particular building inside the Forbidden City. However, it is a composite of two buildings in particular. One of the building is this one. If you notice, the courtyard looks exactly the same. There are 8 pillars, and there are 2 water containers in the front. However, this is a 2-story building. In particular, this kind of style of building is a viewing pavilion style. Unfortunately, they did a lot of research in terms of the building appearance. They probably didn't do a lot of research in terms of building usage. A building with 2 stories generally weren't designed as a resident building for anyone. And if you can take a look over here, this is the second building that they based it on, which, if you take a look, this is 2 stories. They just basically transported the structure of the second story onto our first building. But this second building, once again, is a viewing pavilion. It's not designed for people to live in it. However, the style is still there. It still looks great. And you can still find similar, if not the same, kind of building types inside Forbidden City. So that's very nice. And then we have people who are named after specific either historic figure or figures that are known to the Chinese. The author did use quite a lot of them. None of our main characters are, but there are a few people that are named after someone, and they have exactly the same name. And here's our first one, which is the head lady-in-waiting for Gyoukuyo, which is Hongyang. And she's named after a famous character inside a pretty famous Chinese story. And in that story, the character by the same name is actually a matchmaker. Well, not the kind of matchmaker you think about when you consider like Mulan and everything. She's like servant of this rich girl who helps this rich girl get together with a guy that she likes against their family's wishes. This story has been turned into a lot of traditional shows, dramas, and storytellings, and here's an example of her basically being played in Peking opera. And then we have our second person who's named after a somewhat famous historic figure. We're gonna have more later on, but for this episode, we're only gonna talk about these two because they show up in this episode. And this is our male lead servant, Jinxi's servant Gao Shun. And in case if you're wondering, Gao Shun's named after a general in Three Kingdoms period in China. All of you guys that have ever played Dynasty Warriors, well, she used to fight alongside, well, what Westerners call Lu Bu, which is a butcher of pronunciation. That is a hard word to pronounce for a lot of Westerners, but the name is Lu Bu. See, that's Lu Bu. And Gao Shun is one of his generals. And here we see him represented inside the game. Here is the guy Lu Bu, and he's named after that. It'll be quite interesting later on when we actually learn a bit about his background. And then we're going to talk about some characters in this show. There's a rule of thumb for the characters in this show. All the ladies, well, if not all, but most of the ladies in this show are named after a plant or had a certain plant motive. And we see a good example here in the other ladies in waitings, and all three of them have names that are somewhat related to plant. First of all, we have Yinhua over here, which is just basically cherry blossom or sakura in Mandarin. We have our second character whose name is Guiyuan, and it's written differently, but the pronunciation is the same as this kind of fruit. And she even has a similar kind of hair color. Then we have our third lady, who was Ailan. The name Ailan is not particularly a plant, but a certain part of the name is, which is the lan part, which is a specific kind of orchid that's grown especially in China. And it's quite famous because a lot of people like it. It's inconspicuous, it's not a very dazzling looking plant, but people like it for exactly that reason. It's not overpowering visually. There's a certain nitpick I'm gonna have with the show in terms of motif choice, and it's this. Well, it's not what you see in the foreground. It's the lantern in the back. In particular, the lantern in the back has a stylized Chinese writing on it. Basically, this kind of stylized Chinese character is actually double fortune, which is fortune written twice. However, fortune or happiness written twice like this is exclusively used for weddings. So this is very out of place in like a concubine who's already married to the emperor's place. Like, this is reserved for newlyweds essentially. And you only see these kind of motif display during the actual wedding and maybe the honeymoon. Like, you don't see these symbols everywhere out of random. But unfortunately in this show, you see this pretty much everywhere in different people's decoration and background. That's just my one nitpick about this, because if you put them everywhere, it feels like everybody's getting married constantly, and they constantly have this. And we're gonna talk about food, because Mao Mao, after all, is a food taster. And we're shown with essentially a collection of different food that she's basically having to taste. And unfortunately, it's a mixed bag. Some of these are very typical Chinese food, like the one on upper left corner, that's a very famous Chinese dish, the soup dumpling. And the one on upper right corner, that's also a certain kind of noodle called yangchun mian, which is also quite famous. And then in the center, I'm pretty sure that's just sliced up Peking duck in a roll, which it doesn't get more stereotypically Chinese than that. However, we go to the lower right corner, and that's a tonkatsu, which is a Japanese-style Western food. In case if you're wondering, that's actually derived from schitzels in basically Germany and Austria, and the Japanese put a spin on it. So that's not really eaten in China, and that's not something very ancient. And then we have whatever the stuff are on the lower right left corner, which I can't really tell. Doesn't look like any like Chinese food in particular. So it's kind of hard to tell what they are. And then there's a second kind of slight bit of nitpick I have about the show. Really like a question towards the author's choice in writing. Because in this show, a lot of people tend to write on bamboo tablets, although there are paper. And their explanation to this is that paper is expensive, and then you use bamboo tablets. That's an interesting nod to Chinese history, because before the invention of paper, Chinese used to write on thinly sliced bamboo tablets and then bound together. So that was a historic fact. However, that kind of writing surface quickly went out of style when paper was invented. Now, paper back then was more expensive than they are nowadays, but they're not that expensive. They're not so unaffordable that people actually, only use them for special occasions. Whereas they mentioned it here that, paper is expensive. Therefore, they use that. Because bamboo tablet arguably is a worse writing medium than paper. Mainly due to the fact that once you make a mistake on bamboo tablets, well, with paper you throw them away, it's a waste. But with bamboo tablet, you don't really throw the whole tablet away. You have to use an actual knife to scrape it off, which is a lot of tedious work, and it makes your writing lanes much, much longer. So that actually is more cumbersome. And if they actually mastered paper production isn't extremely difficult. Especially in Imperial House or Real Palace. There's no instance in Chinese history where people mix together paper and bamboo tablet use. Mainly because, the bamboo was cheaper. Like a cheaper alternative. It never was a cheaper alternative, it's just that paper wasn't invented. So that's my only other nitpick about this. And in case if you're wondering, servants in Real Palace are paid. They were paid an allowance, essentially. And depending on their ranks, because they did have a rank system similar to government official, they were just not given an official rank, but they had rank equivalents, and they were paid according to the equivalence. And lastly, I want to talk about some plants that showed up. And the first one is the plant that Mama was eating. Once again, that's a rhododendron, very popular house plant and orchard kind of plant in Asia, in China in particular. And Mama was actually absolutely right. That thing is poisonous. If you eat it, or if you have herbivorous pets and your pets eat it, they're gonna be eaten, well, depending on who ate it. If you ate it, you most likely will get a diarrhea and you get some numbness and paralysis. And if you had a strong reaction, then you might end up in the hospital. It generally wouldn't kill you, but it is a poisonous plant. But the flower looks nice, and as long as you make sure you don't eat it, then it's fine. And the second one is basically all these plants that Mao found that was supposed to be medicinal plants. Judging by the picture, I can actually tell what they are, which is very funny, actually, because they are based on a medicinal plant that looks exactly like this. And it is a kind of plantago plant. You can actually Google it up. Plantago. And plantago plant is generally used for two kinds of things. It's used for constipation, and it's also used as a diuretic. It makes you literally shit and pee a lot. So it's actually quite a useful home remedy if you see a plant that looks exactly like this. I don't recommend you trying it, unless if you know for sure that this is the plant, but this has been used for that. The only thing is, with any kind of like these kind of medicinal plants, these are slightly toxic. So if you use them very often, say if you drink a whole lot of it, you're gonna get sick. And lastly, it's this. Now I'm gonna ask you guys, all you pervs out there, to ignore the three ladies in the front and look at the flower in the back. I know it's difficult for me as well, but flower in the back has a specific meaning because it's a lily flower. And lily in Japanese is called a yuri, and yuri is generally used to refer to basically lesbian relationship in manga and anime. And they put the lily plant in the back specifically for that reason. But if you didn't know that lily is yuri and this is the lily plant, then you miss it. But there, now you know. And the more you know, right? So that's basically all the stuff I found that needed to be addressed or that are interesting for episode 2. There isn't as much, there isn't that much, there isn't quite a lot. In terms of like chocolate as an aphrodisiac and everything else, you can actually watch the short. They post it online and you can just basically, Google it. Google like Apothecary Diaries shorts and they'll show up, and give that a watch. They actually explain that. I'm only explaining whatever that they probably didn't. So I guess that concludes our appendix for episode 2 of Apothecary Diaries. Next episode, I probably will talk a little bit more, and because it's more interesting compared to this one. Not to say that this episode isn't interesting, but the next one, there's many more subtle cultural reference and cultural hints that is worth talking about compared to here, which is mainly just background. So if you'd like to hear more and get notified when I upload the next episode, you can always just subscribe and turn the notification on. I don't really need to teach you guys about it. It doesn't really hurt you to subscribe, but it'll help me a lot to reach more people. Which, once again, I love this show. I want people to enjoy it as much as I do, and I want people to actually enjoy it in detail and know certain backgrounds a little bit more. So, I guess I'll see you guys next time. Dragonfly out.